This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. We're sponsored today by Xbrain, who are the makers of Way Better Protein Powder, and by Bulletproof Coffee. Thank you to Dave, the Bulletproof exec. Annie, she did the first thing everyone does, which is yum.
Yum. Yes.
Like the first time. I'll tell you what's in the coffee.
Yum too.
Yeah. It's got grass-fed butter in there, as opposed to like cream, which a lot of people put in. So that's kind of the special ingredient, and some MCT oil, brain octane oil. So you might feel smarter while you're drinking that. So anyways, you can go to londonreal.tv and check both of those guys out. On to the show. My host today is entrepreneur Colin Pyle, who comes to London from Toronto. He's also my co-host in our new hit series, Silicon Reel.
There we go.
13th episode filmed yesterday. We got VCs, we got founders of startups. It's a lot of fun. So check that out. Thanks for being here.
No worries.
You're doing double duty again this week.
Hey, this is an interesting one for sure. So,
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. It is. So our guest today is Ms. Annie Machon. You are a former intelligence officer for MI5, which is the UK security service. You resigned in 1996 to blow the whistle on spies, incompetence, and crimes. You are now a writer, a commentator, a public speaker on issues like the war on terrorism, the war on drugs, and the war on the internet. Got to hear about this. In 2012, you became a director of LEAP, which is law enforcement against prohibition. Annie, welcome. It's a real pleasure having you here.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. You know, your emails are coming to me all with PGP in front of them, and you're the only person that does that. And like, that was the first thing I noticed, and I showed Colin, and I was like, okay.
So I don't know anything about that.
Okay, well, maybe.
So PGP.
Okay, well, let's ask Annie.
Okay, sure.
Tell us about why you send me emails on that PGP, and we'll just cover that quickly, and then I want to get more into your story.
Sure. Well, I'm surprised I'm the only person you've ever seen use it. Shame on everybody. They should be using it routinely now. It's the only way to protect yourself and ensure you have any sort of privacy against baddies like the NSA and GCHQ. So PGP stands for Pretty Good Protection. I use an open source form of it, which is actually GPG. And it's the one form of email protection that you can get and download for free, which most of the geeks seem to still trust as reliable against snooping from the NSA, GCHQ, and all the rest. So many of us now are beginning to use it in our circles. Actually, some of them have been using it for decades because it's very important. And we're just trying to spread the word about that. And it's not the easiest thing to install, but once you have it, it is impossible for them to crack. So I think I would encourage everyone to Google OpenPGP. No, don't Google, use Startpage to protect your searches. But have a look, and you can download it for free from the internet. And the principle of it is that it's open source, which means all the source code is developed as a hobby by geeks, and they put it out there for free. And because it's all there to be read, the geeks can check what is actually in the source code. So every time the NSA tries to put some nasty little backdoor into it, they eradicate it. So, and of course, they're checking it a lot these days after the Edward Snowden story. So it's very, very safe.
Okay, so it's policed by kind of the own people. The people out there can kind of police the code and make sure there's no funny business.
That's the whole point about open source, yes, and that's why it remains safe. And it's also asymmetric, so you have a public key, which other people can download, and then you have your own encrypted personal private key. And it's only when those two mesh that you can get the protection.
When I see people with their PGP numbers and it's a public piece, and then I'm thinking, how can I send them an encoded message when they have given the code to the public? But you're saying there's another private piece, then those combined makes them able to read my message coded.
Absolutely. So you publish your public key, and you keep your private key just yourself. And then when someone downloads your public key, you can sign and get it all linked up somehow. I always sound like a bit of a fraud talking about this because I'm not actually a geek myself.
Right.
It's not the easiest thing to install at this stage. The open source community are trying to simplify it. However, there is this phenomenon, I don't know if you've heard of crypto parties globally.
No, you just told us about it. Tell us about them.
Well, these are amazing. They were started by a woman called Asher Wolf in Australia only last year. And this is where you get a bunch of geeks volunteering their services and holding a crypto party in their local city, and they say, anyone who's interested, bring your laptop and we will help you set up encryption. We will help you secure your laptop against snooping. So these have just exploded across the planet now. In every major city across the West, pretty much, you can find a crypto party at some point. So I'd advise anyone to go along if they're feeling a bit twitchy about trying to get secure themselves and getting it wrong. Then there are plenty of geeks from this open source community who will be very happy to help. In fact, fact, there might well be another one coming up in London at the end of the month. So
Okay,
I advise everyone to go.
We should attend that and check it out for Silicon Reel. We have a large audience that's in the States, and, they watch James Bond movies, but I don't know if they know the difference between some of the different organizations. And I was wondering if you could just quickly break down the definitions of MI5, MI6, and now GCHQ, which I didn't even know that much about.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, we have 3 primary intelligence agencies in the UK. MI5 is where I used to work, and that's the UK Domestic Security Service, which used to focus on counter-espionage and counter-subversion, the political stuff. And then they took on an increasing amount of counter-terrorism as well from the 1990s onwards. They are known officially as, or used to be, as UKSS, because that's what the UK Security Service stands for. One of our German colleagues pointed out it wasn't a terribly nice name.
Okay, from the SS and the German army. Okay, now I get it. Okay.
So they were supposedly just working to protect national security within the UK, but of course, as the global terrorism phenomenon has exploded, literally, their work is increasingly international as well. Then there is MI6, or Secret Intelligence Service, and they are an international intelligence gathering agency. So they're the sort of James Bond wannabes. They were just supposed to try and plant spies abroad in companies or embassies or whatever and get the raw material back and then send it into MI5 for analysis. And then you have GCHQ, which is Government Communications Headquarters, which is based down in Cheltenham, which used to be the most secretive agency, and now, of course, is very much in the public consciousness after Edward Snowden. And they are the snoopers. They came out of Bletchley Park, and they will hoover up all our electronic communications. And they are very unaccountable, shall we say.
Okay.
So
is that roughly equivalent to FBI, CIA, and NSA, or are the lines getting so blurred these days that it's really hard to say?
Almost, yeah. GCHQ is definitely very partnered up with the NSA. In fact, they've had decades-long complete sharing capability under a program called Echelon, which meant that they could snoop on each other's citizens, each other's countries, without any warrantry, without any oversight, and then share it with each other. So they get around any sort of democratic oversight. MI6, yes, very much the CIA. In fact, the CIA was modelled on them. MI5 is slightly different because they don't have police capability. They used to be more counterintelligence, counter-subversion. So they're not quite the same as the FBI. In fact, we have the Serious Organised Crime Agency here, which is really the UK FBI.
Okay.
So MI5 is unique. But they're all, a very British model. They've been around for 100 years. They evolved with no oversight. For the first 80 years of their life, there was nothing. No MPs could ask questions about them. They didn't officially exist. And they were there to stop Russians and to stop political subversives. Then, of course, that threat went away, and they're casting around for work. So rather than our government say, well, OK, what are the threats to our national security, and how can we best protect the UK's national security? They said, we have this agency, which has got free time on its hands. Let's find them new work, whether or not they're actually up to that job. So you get these old spooks then having to move into counterterrorism, which is very, very different, where, fast-paced, investigative activities, and in the old days you had to gather evidence and put people on trial and things like that. And they had trouble trying to adapt. Plus, because they were so secretive, it was a bit of a sort of misfit democratically. Not, if they're trying to police people and put people on trial, but there's no real oversight like you have with the police. So it's a very British mess, is the short answer.
Wow. It's interesting now because we've had Edward Snowden. We've had him kind of on the run. I guess now he's been given asylum, maybe temporarily in Russia. And I know you probably feel a bit. I don't know what the right word is. You feel similar to the way he might have felt because you were kind of on the run there for a while in '96, and you had to leave the country. And I was just wondering what your perspective is on Snowden. I know it's a very big question, and the way it's kind of played out in the last 3 months, and if your opinions have changed since the first information came out.
I think my opinions have strengthened along the same line, actually. But yes, he's the only other intelligence whistleblower I'm aware of who came out and preemptively went on the run before the story broke in the media. Most other whistleblowers out themselves, and then get the story out, or they get caught for leaking. So it did bring back a lot of memories, and the sort of tension of trying to flee a country and get through the border controls and get on that plane, and then finally you're in the air and you're safe, is quite something to live through.
Is this from you flying London to Paris when you made that first jump?
We were flying London to Amsterdam, actually. It was about the last flight out of the UK on a bank holiday weekend that we could find.
Okay.
So we were lucky to get out when we did. And that was only about 12 hours ahead of the story breaking. So it was all very, near the knuckle. So, yeah, I feel a lot of empathy for what he's been through. In terms of what he's done, I think he's done he's planned it very, very carefully. He's been very strategic about how he's released the information, chosen the information, released it, and then argued about why he's doing it. And he's been very clear about that. You know, he would die for his country. He wants to try and improve the way his country operates within its own boundaries and protect its citizens. But he also wants the global population to know how they are being abused as well by this global surveillance infrastructure. And the fact that he said his one fear right up front was that what he had done would change nothing, I think says a lot, because he really wants to affect that change for public good. So I just get the sense he probably has looked at other whistleblowers' stories and experiences, and he's learned from our mistakes. So I think he's played it very carefully. I mean, I've called him Whistleblower 2.0, but I think he's way out there, actually. He's very ahead of the game, yeah.
Did he have help? Do you think he had coaching from, the WikiLeaks people or Assange or anyone, or do you think this was his own masterminded plan as far as how to release the information?
I think my understanding is that it was a solo effort, at least to begin with. Okay. My sense is that he spent a lot of time angsting over whether or not he should do it, from what he said publicly, which is very little, and that he chose the material he thought very strongly in the public interest, and he plotted his way around doing it. You know, he spent months trying to identify a really good journalist to work with. And he did. I mean, Glenn Greenwald is a very, very good journalist with a high-profile track record on the subjects that Snowden wanted to talk about.
Was it Guardian? Is that the one?
Well, he went to Greenwald first.
Okay.
I mean, Greenwald has different columns on different places, but yes, obviously he leaked it in The Guardian. But I think that process of identifying the right journalist to work for shows that there was months of planning. And then we know that he emailed Glenn, I think around Christmas time last year, and it took months for the whole thing to build up. So he would have been on his own at that point, wondering what to do, not being able to talk to anybody or confide in anybody. So very, very isolating. Obviously then, once the story broke, then Greenwald has been very supportive and has the fire in his belly to fight for his source. And obviously WikiLeaks, as a sort of high-tech conduit, a publisher for whistleblowers, is really very keen to help protect him as much as they can with their capabilities at the moment. So I think those first few months must have been terrifying, to be on his own, knowing that if he's caught, if anything slips out, he could face the rest of his life in prison with none of the information out there. So that must have been so frightening for him.
Well, why a UK journalist? Is there a reason you think he didn't go to the US? Or do you think he might not have even trusted the US sources or the electronics to get to that source?
Well, he is a very capable geek, so I think he's played that very well as well. He knew his way around the electronic surveillance. No, Glenn is American. He's a human rights lawyer turned activist, turned journalist, and he's based in Rio. So it's just he happens to be a columnist on the Guardian newspaper in London. Okay. But the Guardian also has offices in New York and elsewhere. But I think, I've said for years when I've done lectures about how do you blow the whistle, that the one way that journalists can be picked by a potential whistleblower is to have the right profile. We spent months looking at papers and seeing who might be someone good to work with, what the right profile might be. I think that's what he did. So I think it's more the fact it was Greenwald himself, because he's been very outspoken in support of WikiLeaks. He's been very outspoken against the erosion of our civil liberties and things like the Patriot Act in America. And because he's got that legal and journalistic profile, and he's a fighter, I think that's why Snowden reached out to him.
So it has to be trust, and then he also has to have credibility as a journalist.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And there might be other hopeful whistleblowers sitting behind their desks in the CIA or MI6 or whatever now, and they will be going through the same process and being very careful about who they select and also how they communicate with them.
Did any of the information that Snowden revealed surprise you at all? or was this like, I've heard a lot of people come out with the I told you so, we have been talking about this, a lot of people on the Joe Rogan show have been talking about this, and I listened with one ear, like a lot of the public, and just dismissed it. But were you surprised by anything?
Not really. I mean, as you say, everyone suspected what was going on, but to have the proof, to have it really rammed up in your face, I think is still shocking. The sheer scale of it as well. But I mean, of course, I was more aware than most about the sort of capabilities they have. And one of the things that I remember from the good old days in the 1990s was this Echelon program, which was the NSA, CIA, and also Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, all sharing their SIGINT, their electronic surveillance capabilities, and working their way around each of their democratic oversight processes by using Echelon. So I was aware of that. I suppose the updated version and the sheer scale and capability which the internet offers the spies is still quite shocking to have it confirmed.
And then more articles have come out where it's the NSA has shown that they can break a lot of these encryption technologies, where they can go through a lot of things they've done through wiretaps and court orders, and they've had all of these different ways the NSA is getting this information.
Well, also that, but also I think the other thing that was vaguely shocking to me as a Brit was quite how far up the arse of the NSA GCHQ had crawled.
Okay. Does that really surprise you? I mean, you worked for MI5 for a long time. Isn't that the history of the collaboration? We saw Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. We know there's a long history of them being constantly supplying information to the Americans and then not really getting a lot in return.
Oh, the so-called special relationship. Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Sure, I was aware of that, but I think just the fact that information's now come out showing the scale of the funding that the NSA is putting into GCHQ, to show the internal reports that demonstrate how focused GCHQ senior management are on providing the information that the NSA wants, not what GCHQ and the British government might require for British national security. That really shows that we are just a vassal state and that GCHQ is just doing the bidding of its paymasters. And I think that's shocking as well, because if they are there to protect our national security, our national sovereignty, and they're focusing on the priorities of the NSA, then how is that helping British sovereignty? It's not. So I think that's little bits like that I find the confirmation, again, is shocking.
Right. It's interesting because geopolitics are fascinating. And, the fact that the UK always had this special relationship with the US is because it's an island nation. It doesn't want to see Europe united. We've seen what that happens. It's dangerous. They're always going to be allied to the US. The US is a big global power. I mean, it's great when people say, Tony Blair, stop being in the back pocket of the US. But is there any choice, really, for the British government than to be heavily allied with the US? Because they have got huge powers like France and Germany and the EU to contend with, maybe not militarily, but economically. I mean, is part of that understandable or not? The expression you're giving me, I'm guessing not.
I think historically it is understandable,
Okay.
After what happened in the Second World War, and also the fact that the UK was excluded from the first round of the EU, the old European Economic Community.
Yeah.
So, of course, they're going to buddy up with the US because it gives them a seat at the top table still. And the fact that they are the only country that can supply the sort of capability that GCHQ and MI6 and MI5 can in that so-called special relationship allows them to feel that they still have a major role to play globally. The establishment still, I think, to this day, can't really fathom that we're not really a global player, that we're second tier, that we lost the empire almost a century ago. So they're trying to hang on to past glory by hanging on to the US coattails. The other option would have been to integrate more with Europe, of course, but that opportunity's gone. So.
And it probably isn't going to happen. Where do we go from here? I mean, I talk to people I know in the States, and they have this kind of a shrug thing that with the information. It was a big shock. It was a shock to me. I mean, I was like, Jesus, every Gmail I'm typing, but a lot of them are just like, yeah, there's not much we can do about it, and they've kind of rolled on. What do you think we go from here? We've got all this new information. How do we behave different? Or what do we do different as citizens?
Got to be smarter. We have to be.
Okay.
Get teched up and protect ourselves, because we can't guarantee our governments are going to protect our privacy. And, the right to privacy was put in place in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, straight after the Second World War, to stop the abuses of Nazism, to stop the abuses of totalitarianism. And we seem to forget and think that human rights are a luxury. They're not. They're fundamental, and privacy is one of them. And the reason they're so important now is, many people say, I've done nothing wrong, I've got nothing to hide.
Yeah.
But that's bogus, because we know from the lessons of history that what you're doing today might still be legal, but tomorrow they might change the laws and it's not.
Right.
So suddenly you might be out there waving a placard as a part of an Occupy protest or environment protest, thinking I'm exercising my democratic rights. Then they change the law. Suddenly you're defined as a domestic extremist or terrorist, and we all know how terrorists can be treated now. You don't have any rights. So the goalposts can be shifted very easily. We saw how that worked in the run-up to Nazi Germany in the 1930s. The journalists, the trade unionists, the communists, the Jews, and so it went on. And that can happen in any country. And I have to say, looking at the shredding of all our civil liberties in both the US and the UK since 9/11, what we're looking at now is a de facto police state. All the laws are in place, they're just not being applied to most citizens yet. So I think it's not a case of having anything to hide, it's having a case that I have a right to privacy, and I can't guarantee my government will uphold that right, therefore I need to take the steps to do it. Because if I don't have privacy, I can't freely read or watch information on the internet without them knowing what I'm reading or watching. I can't freely say what I think to my contacts without them listening. And I can't, I just don't have the freedom of thought, therefore, to put together new ideas. So I begin to self-censor. And then once you start self-censoring because you're frightened of what the authorities are picking up, how does the argument you've got nothing to hide still work?
Right, then it is a police state.
It is,
and then
yeah.
and then Big Brother's watching, and
Yeah.
your life is completely controlled by your own paranoia or by your own fear.
Yeah, exactly. So, in order to have freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, all those basic rights that we spent hundreds of years fighting for in the Western world, in Europe, we need free media. And I don't mean, the Daily Mail or the BBC. I mean, the internet as our free media. That's what we need. It's fundamental.
I was trying to explain this concept to someone in the States, and they're like, I have nothing to hide, that usual story. And I was like, all right, well, they're going to record everything you've done, say, for the next 15, 20 years. And say at some point you become an activist, or say you run for political office, and someone doesn't like you who has the NSA connections. They don't even have to go public about that email you sent, or about that affair you had, or about that website you went on. All they have to do is send you a private message and say, look, we have this information, we can make it public, or you can just shut up, get out of the race, go do your separate ways.
Absolutely.
And that's a lot of power.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or you might be an activist when you're younger. And then, further down the line, you've grown up and you're in a nice corporate job and all the rest of it. And suddenly that group becomes deemed to be a terrorist group or something. And then, oh, my God, you were a member of a terrorist group when you were younger. So, these things can follow you. And if that sounds fanciful, I mean, look how they treated the Occupy movement, both in the City of London, where a leaked police document was given to Occupy, showing that they were being deemed to be a domestic extremist or terrorist group. And this was a letter that the police sent out to all the banks in the area. So Occupy could have been arrested under the terrorist legislation if they chose to. And again, in New York, we saw the same thing, where suddenly CCTV cameras were everywhere and monitoring their every move, and all their information was scooped up. So just because you're out there protesting the banks doesn't mean, you can't be black-bagged, potentially.
Yeah, and I walked around and saw all those protests, and there wasn't really anything extremist or violent going on there. It was literally an Occupy movement, and it seemed to be a shift, a mindset are trying to demonstrate.
Yeah.
It's tough. I find like people are so busy in their lives, and there's so much on their mind. Like me talking, about my own life, and so I think that way often. I'm just like, I got nothing to hide right now, and it's quite encompassing on a person's life to take the steps to make sure that no one's watching. And
Actually, it's not that difficult.
so I have to go to one of these crypto
yeah,
parties.
it would be the simplest way to do it.
Yeah.
And once you've got it set up, then it'll just run. So it won't impede your life at all.
So it's fine.
Yeah, it's just taking that first step, having the awareness that there are requirements to do this, understanding the importance of privacy, and then doing it, and then live as you would before.
And that's it.
Yeah.
It's like any human right. When you have it for so long, I think you
Right.
forget it.
Yes.
And then you don't realize that it's a crucial part of living in a free world.
Right.
And
it's something that you only realize when it comes to bite you, right? Because I think if you just kept going and for the next 50 years and I never went in politics or big CEO job or anything like that, then maybe nothing would happen. Do you know what I mean?
If you're lucky, but if the fascists are in power,
well,
who's to say?
exactly, I know, but it's something that, today's actions, the reaction doesn't happen today, it happens down the road. And I think people often put those in the back of their mind.
Well,
right?
let me explain what it's like to live with no privacy, because I have.
Yeah.
After the whistleblowing years, and we went on the run around Europe and then lived in exile in Paris for 2 years. And during those years, it was a huge story, exposing the crimes of MI6 and MI5. And David Shayler, my former partner, was in the newspapers all the time. It was a story that ran and ran. And we knew we were being watched. So we had a flat where we couldn't assume that the rooms in our flat weren't bugged. Including our bedroom, where we couldn't assume that our communications were not intercepted. In fact, we knew they were, because sometimes they played up and we caught them out. So you can't even have a word with your mother, for example, who's upset about something, because everything is being recorded.
Right.
and this is late 90s. This isn't
Yeah,
like
Yeah, this is late
communism
90s, yeah.
70s. This is fairly recent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I would have, if something happened with the family, I'd have to spend hours running around the locality with telephone cards in order to find different public phone boxes, so I could just speak to my mother with privacy. That's assuming that her phone wasn't bugged as well. So there's that. And then there's also the sense that your friends can be reporting back on you. So, for example, we know a couple were turned. They were forced to report back on us because they were caught out doing stuff, minor stuff. So it's this sort of awareness that you have no privacy at all is very corrosive to the human spirit. And sure, we were in an unusual position then. We'd blown the whistle and we'd taken on the authorities knowing what to expect. But this is the position that we're all in now, whether we're doing anything wrong or not. So it's just that corrosiveness of it, I think, is until you have experienced it, you don't realise quite how bad it is.
Can you give us a little bit about your background? I know you told the story a million times, but for people that don't know what happened with you, can you give us kind of the summary?
Potted history. Yes, I worked in MI5 as an intelligence officer from 1991 to 96.
How did they recruit you?
I wanted to be a diplomat, so they sent me a Ministry of Defence letter saying there may be other jobs I find more interesting.
Okay, was that based on your background and your qualifications, do you think?
Probably, yes. I mean, I was at Cambridge and classics, so there were a lot of classicists in the spies for
They
some
like
reason.
recruiting from Oxford and
They do,
Cambridge.
yeah. So I went along and I got recruited over a period of 10 months. I wasn't interested to begin with because at that point in 1990 they had a stinking reputation. There'd been a whole series of spy scandals in the 80s, including subverting the miners' strike and Peter Wright's Spycatcher best-selling book and things like that. So I wasn't interested, but they were shifting their area of work to counter-terrorism. And they said that they didn't do political stuff, the Cold War was over, and they had to obey the laws and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, it sounded good. Eventually, after 10 months, I started working there. And I joined, and then my partner, ex-partner, David Shaler, joined soon after. We met and got together. And we worked there for 6 years on the political stuff, which they said they no longer did. Irish terrorism, international terrorism. And the stuff we saw going wrong included files on government ministers, which of course is a problem because it goes back to they have information that can then be used to pressure the ministers. Illegal phone taps, IRA bombs that could and should have been prevented, then weren't and people died. And then MI5 lied about it to cover up to government. Innocent students going to prison for a terrorist operation they didn't commit in London. And then MI6 funding Al-Qaeda in Libya in an illegal operation to try and assassinate Colonel Gaddafi in 1996. And this went wrong. Innocent people died. It was illegal under UK law.
Right.
And that's what broke the camel's back. So we decided to resign and go public.
So you were close, and then the Libya thing, you were like, I don't want to be a part of this organization anymore?
Very much. It was sort of incremental stages. And as you move between different departments, you think, OK, that's an old historic department, perhaps the others are better. OK, this manager is appalling, perhaps the next section. But things kept going wrong and escalating. And many of us left around the same time. I mean, our intake was flooding out that year. They had record numbers because everybody hated what they were seeing. Most of them couldn't go public because they had children or mortgages or whatever. So we did. And David had some journalistic experience before he'd been a spy as well, so he sort of knew that world a bit better. And he approached a newspaper. There was very slow sort of courtship because they distrusted each other. And finally, the story broke in 1997. We went on the run the day before it broke, and literally on the run around Europe for a month. And then I went back and was arrested, and our flat was torn up by the police and everything. And then David's brother and his best friends and journalists and students, it widened ever out, were also arrested because of this case. Then we had a year living in hiding in France. Then they arrested David and tried to extradite him from Paris to the UK, and they failed, but he went to prison then. And then we had 2 more years in Paris, which is lovely. So
Worst places to be on.
yeah, exactly. If you're going to exile yourself,
Yeah.
then go to Paris.
Yeah.
And then he came back voluntarily in 2000 to stand trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act. And over 2 years after that, finally got in front of a jury and, of course, was convicted. Because what they did, they had a whole series of pre-trial hearings which shut down what he could say in the courtroom. So he couldn't say anything in his own defence, why he'd done what he'd done or anything. So, of course, he was found guilty. So that was the story, really. What was more shocking, actually, in a way, I mean, it's bad enough for him to go to prison, but was the media coverage of it, because the judge made a formal ruling at the end of the court case, as they always do, which is, Shaler did what he did in the public interest, there was no financial motivation, no lives were put at risk. And yet the headlines the next day from the journalists in the courtroom said precisely the opposite. It's like Shaler sells agent lies down the river for money, which is like, whoop. So
How long? What was his sentence?
he was facing 6 years max, but he got 6 months, actually.
Okay.
I did a very good mitigation plea for him. In fact, it was the only time either of us could say in the whole bloody legal process why we had done what we'd done. So I think that helped. But
Sure.
Yeah, it was difficult. And he spent quite a long time in Belmarsh, which is quite rough. It's, the high security prison.
Okay. In retrospect, would you have done it again? Did you expect that, pardon my French, shitstorm to happen or not?
We sort of did. The slight problem was timing, because it took so long to get the newspaper to start even running the most low-level stories in the summer of 1997, after this very slow courtship, that the story broke in, I'm trying to think of the date now, July 24th, and as expected, what David was expecting was there would be a shitstorm. There would be pushback from certain press, and other press would call for an inquiry. And he also expected the government to injunct him, take out an injunction against him and the media. And they did, which of course meant the shitstorm grew, because all the media then said, why are you doing this? You can't gag us, we're the free media. And that was great. And suddenly we had a lot of support, and there was a push for an inquiry and a push for him to give his evidence to the government and for there to be a proper look at what the spies were getting up to. And then we woke up the next morning to the news on the press that Princess Diana had died that night in Paris. So that was us lost. I mean, no more media coverage. And we were just lost in France at that point.
And that was it. That was it, because that was going to be in the media for the next month or two.
Yeah.
And then
we just lost any pressure. Anymore. Yeah. So the timing was just so unfortunate. You cannot factor that in. I mean, in a slightly gruesome way, when Ed Snowden's story broke this year, I don't know if you noticed, but Nelson Mandela went in hospital and almost died, and then they kept him alive and kept him alive. And I was just thinking, they're going to pull the plug at a crucial moment of the Edward Snowden story.
To bury it.
Yeah.
Does the web go that far, or is there a point where you're like, this web doesn't go that far?
Well, it's just me being paranoid, I think, and a bit gruesome. But yes, so it did remind me of of all the stories that could have knocked the Shayla whistleblowing off the headlines at that point. Pretty much that was the only one that could.
Yeah.
So after that, we had to sort of fight a rearguard action ever afterwards. So if that hadn't happened, there is probably a parallel world out there where there would have been an inquiry and David wouldn't have gone to prison twice and the spies would have had a chance to reform, because that's all we were pushing for. If they work unaccountably and out of control, then, and in a very secret world, then mistakes are covered up, they're not learnt from. And you get this sort of groupthink mentality where it becomes the norm to keep on working that way and keep on making the same mistakes. So actually we get less protection from spies when they're not overseen properly and not reformed properly. And I think indeed that's what we've seen since 9/11, where in the 1990s they did not get involved in torture cases at all, because they'd seen how counteractive they were in Northern Ireland in the 70s. So the old boys said, we're not going to do this. Then of course you get 9/11 and they start getting quite brutal along with the American intelligence agencies. And we have a situation where their groupthink, the sort of closed secret world of the spies, want to please the CIA and the FBI. So they start doing things, and nobody can challenge the fact that they're using torture. Nobody can have that ethical discussion because they're told to shut up and not rock the boat. And because it's so inward-looking as an organisation, you get this groupthink. And I think that's how they spiraled down this very dangerous path of torture and extraordinary rendition and things like that, secret courts as well now. So,
has that changed? Has that been reversed by some of the public knowledge of some of these things being done? Or do you think the mentality is the same?
I think the mentality is the same, if not getting worse, because they can get away with it. They will continue to get away with it. I mean, we saw this around the GCHQ disclosures when suddenly this Tempera exercise operation was announced. I don't know if you remember this, where GCHQ mainlines into the fibre optic cables, the key fibre optic cables between North America and Europe, and they pick up everything for the NSA that way. And this is their jewel in the crown, apparently, their unique capability, which they can offer to their overlords in the NSA. And that gives them the leverage. Wow. So at that point, there was a lot of outcry. At that point, our Foreign Secretary, William Hague, stood up and said, oh, yes, but they're doing this, but they're doing it with my oversight, as required under RIPA, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, and it's all legal. And then more information came out showing that actually it wasn't all legal, because the sheer scale of that data mining was way beyond the scope which could be covered by RIPA and signed off by William Hague. So the fact that this is exposed, the fact that it is outside the law, and the fact that the government is very happy straight away to stand up and say, no, they're working within the law, we'll protect them, shows that nothing has shifted. And I think it'll only get worse, because there isn't a will from most people to push back and demand proper accountability, because, as you said at the start, you got nothing to hide.
Yeah, in that parallel world, would you and David have been heroes in some way?
I think in that parallel world, we would still have been heroes to some people and villains to others. I mean, this is the sort of schizophrenic nature of whistleblowing, is that this is how you're always deemed to be a traitor or a hero. And it's actually quite a strain on the psyche to live with that, I think, as well. So I think we would always been seen that way, with that duality. However, we might have made a difference. There might have been some change effected. And this again goes back to what Edward Snowden said. The one thing he's really frightened of is that what he does will not affect any change, because people just won't care.
Is Edward Snowden a hero, in your opinion?
To me, yes. I think he's gone about it very carefully, with great forethought, and everything exposed to date has been very much in our public interest, we the people. And I think he's been very brave, knowing what he faces, because in the UK, if you do this, you face 2 years in prison for each charge under the Official Secrets Act. Of course, now Obama is waging this war on whistleblowers in the US. I think he's gone after 7 since he's come to power, which is more, under the Espionage Act 1917, which is more than all other presidents have tried to use that act against whistleblowers since 1917. So he is waging a war on whistleblowers. And seeing what happened to Chelsea Manning, and the treatment and the torture and the 35 years in prison, and seeing what happened and was threatened to the NSA's Tom Drake, for example, Snowden knew what he was facing by doing this, and to still go ahead and do it shows, I think, ultimate bravery.
Is he a martyr by giving up his life to expose this information, or is it not that noble?
I don't think he is a martyr. I don't think he's given up his life. I think he's fighting and being as clever as possible not to have to give up his life to do it, but he has said, for the record, that he would be willing to if that's what it came to. But I think if he can survive this process somehow, build a new life somehow, and get through it, he will be a wonderful beacon of hope to future potential whistleblowers. Because the only way our governments can stop whistleblowing is to crush the whistleblower every time a big one comes out. So once you crush them, everyone else is too scared for a decade to do something similar. And then, of course, the fear fades, generations change, and then a new whistleblower comes out. It happens every decade. But because of that crushing of each whistleblower, it takes that long to come forward. So I think if Snowden can be seen to survive, then that will accelerate that process, and we'll have more whistleblowers coming out. And we need them. We need them.
Do you think it's easier for whistleblowers now than sort of when you did it in the late 90s? Has technology made it easier or harder?
Only if you're a geek like
Right.
Edward Snowden,
Sure.
so you know what you're doing.
Yeah.
I think that's what's made him so effective.
Okay.
Other than that, no, it was easier to do it in the old days.
Right. Yeah.
But was it the more censorship then? Could the president make a phone call and say, quash this story?
Right.
Yeah.
And now they can't. So is it easier in that way?
No, I think the censorship is the same as it always has been.
Okay.
It's always been there, where our Prime Minister could ring up the editor of the newspaper and summon him to Downing Street and take him to the garden and berate him.
But what if it's a blog, or what if it's this? They can't control that as
so
much.
the tech increases the capability, potentially, of the whistleblower, provided they don't get caught doing it. So unless you're a top-notch geek, you probably will get caught because you'll leave traces somewhere. The media has always been a potential blockage anyway, the old media, because they can be censored, they can be denoticed in this country, for example, they can be injuncted, they can be issued with production orders from the secret police to hand over all the material, which the whistleblower has provided as proof of what they're claiming, which is what our newspaper had to do. They had to hand over all the proof. And that's why I've been so supportive of the WikiLeaks model, because here the whistleblower can securely give the information and they can hold it, and it can't be seized back by the police. So that information, that proof will always be out there. And then the whistleblower can either out themselves afterwards and say, it's me, I want to fight for this. These are the issues I think worth fighting for. Or they can remain an anonymous leaker and get on with their lives. So in terms of the tech, it makes it much more difficult to stay under the radar, unless you're a top-notch geek. It's much easier to be traced. In terms of the old media, there is much a blockage, as I think they always have been. They're too vulnerable to censorship. And also they've created another problem for themselves, which is most of the investigative journalists are not tech savvy enough to protect the whistleblower either. And this is something, because I talk at journalism conferences all over the place, and I'm quite aware of the security aspects. Most journalists are just not even aware of what they don't know.
Yep.
So, you get that fateful phone call from a possible whistleblower, and then how are you going to demonstrate to that potential top-notch geek that you understand the security implications and you can protect their security? How will they trust you? And again, this is why I think Greenwald was chosen, because he has a track record of being very on top of these issues too.
He must have been watched. Someone must be constantly watching him.
Oh, now, yeah.
Now.
Absolutely.
And during, was he known as
Yes.
that guy? So
Yeah.
he's taking steps to worry about his encryption, even people listening.
Is that why he lives in Rio?
Yes, because he's been there a few years now, so
Yeah.
I'm presuming, yeah.
Sure.
No, there was a very interesting piece. He and Laura Poitras, the filmmaker who made the first film, wrote together a while ago, which was how the story broke, how the contact was made. And it was Laura, actually, who had such a good track record because she's been under surveillance doing other films and things like that. So she's very tech savvy. So she and Glenn made sure that their systems were absolutely locked down in the most paranoid fashion in order to protect this unknown whistleblower who's reaching out to them. That's what journalists need to be able to demonstrate to the world, to intelligence whistleblowers particularly, because they are going to know what they're facing. They're going to know how they're going to be watched, and they're going to be really paranoid. So the journalist needs to take that equally seriously. Otherwise, they're just seen as amateurs.
It's a very good point if you're listening and you're a journalist. You know, I keep thinking J. Edgar Hoover. I don't know why. But, you know, if there's a movie out recently, but, you know, J. Edgar Hoover ran the FBI and the intelligence in the U.S. for 6 presidential administrations. And he basically, you know, had presidents effectively scared of him because he had files on all of the presidents, all of the Congress, a lot like you said, MI5 or MI6 was, MI5 had files on the MPs. So do you think we're going to get at some point to that scenario? I mean, is Obama in control of the NSA? Does it get to be where it can be out of control and it can be threatening people in that way?
I'm sure he already is.
Okay.
So,
yes.
No doubt about it. No, I mean, I think our democracies are broken, both in the UK and the US. They're corporatocracies now. You know, it's the big corporations, it's the big military security intelligence complex, which is way worse than the military-industrial complex. It's sort of burgeoned into this amorphous monster in the last 50 years. And we've seen repeatedly that lobby groups, trade blocs with strong lobby powers and everything can subvert our democratic process totally already. So the NSA and organisations like that, as well as their secret information, their secret power, will be part of that process.
It's interesting because he kept those files so secret, and like when he died, they were apparently destroyed. Who knows? But it's yeah, I don't know. But it's strange because this information that the NSA has now on everyone that could potentially become public. So you don't have one crazy old man who's guarding these files. It could be everyone having access, which is even more dangerous.
And then suddenly all your personal information's out there. Would you feel as comfortable then that you've done nothing wrong and you've got nothing to hide? You want your medical records out there. You want your little visit to the local STD clinic a few years ago out there in public. You know, secret phone calls to your mistress or whatever. I mean, it could all potentially go out there. And suddenly, if you think about it in those terms, all of us want privacy. That's why it's important to maintain it.
Besides the encrypting ourselves, I mean, what's the main thing that's on your mind, like going forward, as far as issues that you think need to be addressed? I mean, you talked about journalism protecting their sources, you protecting your own self. Are there bigger movements? Are there political ideas that you think we should be really moving forward or pushing everyone for transparency, or is that futile?
I think there's a few rays of hope at the moment, certainly in Europe, because of the Echelon scandal, you know, the sort of Five Eyes thing that was exposed in the 1990s. Because of that, there were a series of hearings at the EU Parliament a year afterwards. And so they came up with a strategy for what they should do about communications across Europe then. And a report was issued in July 2001. Unfortunately, it was then buried 2 months later. But the European Parliament recommended that Europe wean itself off its dependency on American infrastructure, internet infrastructure, American internet companies, all that sort of thing, because they could see the potential for abuse through the Echelon system. So what they recommended was that European countries focus on developing their own companies, their own Facebooks or, you know, telecoms or even the fibre optic cables to protect against this American predator. And then, as I said, the report got buried because of 9/11. Now, though, because of all the scandals, the EU's gone back to it, and there are ongoing hearings at the moment in the Parliament. And many political campaigners are pushing to go back to this is an opportunity for Europe to protect our citizens' security and our privacy, because we have a duty as governments of these people not to allow a foreign power to snoop on them all, but also to develop our economies by building up local infrastructure and local business. So that could be very good for our broken European economies if our politicians will go with common sense and not be lobbied out of it by some, or get some nasty phone call from the White House, I think. In fact, Duncan Campbell, the guy who broke the Echelon story way back, has now given evidence to the European hearing. And I think I'm going to be there at the end of the month. So
okay.
There's a lot of us going there and really feeding in a lot of information. So I think that's one aspect of hope. And organisations like Anonymous or the Pirate Party or whoever can activate around these sort of things, like they did to try and stop the ACTA bill last year, which was another ghastly piece of Americanese that was, you know, they were trying to get the European Parliament to rubber stamp, which is about piracy in the EU. So we can make a difference still, and I think this is a golden opportunity if we can get enough people to push for it.
So, like, Mark Zuckerberg was in Washington this week. Like, what, is that just all just smoke and mirrors? Do you think he's actually like a pretty good guy and he actually doesn't want to give an entire feed to the US, or is he just in their pockets?
I don't know if in the pockets, but
Yeah.
I mean, the whole setup, the whole infrastructure of
Right.
Facebook and the way it operates is the spy's wet dream.
Right.
I mean, it does, we offer up our lives to whoever wants to watch,
Sure.
including all our networks, including where we're going to meet, including what campaigns we're involved in. That's what spies used to have to do. They spend weeks,
Yeah.
trying to identify your friends and things.
And here it's boom.
Yeah, here, have it,
Yeah. Yeah.
So the fact that this network exists is not per se malign. It's a bit stupid of us to just, give our lives over for free. But the fact that it's now been proven there are these backdoors, there has been cooperation with all these big companies like Google and Facebook as well.
Yeah.
I think that is an issue, and whatever happened along the line, it has been corrupted now. So that is a problem.
You're a very busy woman with a lot of these different activities you're working on. And so I'm wondering, why do you get involved with LEAP? And you're a director of LEAP. And if you can tell people, what is LEAP?
Thank you. Law Enforcement Against Prohibition is this global organisation. It's only been going for just over a decade. It's a global organisation of serving and former legal professionals who protest the failed war on drugs. They say that prohibition is what causes many of the problems that we associate with drug use. So we have lawyers and police officers and some former spooks and DEA people, prison governors, judges, even some drug czars, including the former EU drug czar, who now say, from our professional expertise and experience, the war on drugs has failed, and this is why. And it can be looking at the problems caused at the local community level, with the breakdown of trust between policing and policed, or it can be on a more global level. So, for example, the fact that the global drug trade is worth up to $500 billion per year, and all that goes into the hands of not just organised crime and violent gangsters, but also funds over half the designated terrorist groups on the planet.
Yeah.
So you think about it. We fight the war on drugs. That creates prohibition. That drives this huge trade. I think it's the third biggest trade in the whole world, underground and into the hands of these people, including our terrorist enemies. And then on the other hand, we're waging the war on terror. So we have this
I've never thought about it that way.
cycle of
Two-front war.
Yeah, exactly.
For no reason.
It's a win-win for the military security complex.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
great for all, prisons, it's great for law enforcement, it's great for the military, it's great for everything like that. So it's big business.
And what does LEAP do? Are you trying to make these things aware? Do you have certain initiatives that you're working on? Is it big in the States, or is it more difficult in the States?
Well, it started in the States.
Okay.
Because, of course, the US is the fountainhead of the war on drugs. I mean, they're the sort of the turd in the pipe when it comes to reforming the UN conventions.
I haven't heard that one before. That's a good one.
So, yes, it was founded 11 years ago by 5 police officers there, and it's now grown exponentially. So we have a presence in 120 countries globally. We've got over 100,000 supporters. What we aim to do is educate primarily and just say, look, we're not some free the weed group who wants to have a toke. From our professional expertise, we say the war on drugs has failed, and here's why. And here's why we need to have a rethink and an adult debate about what the options are. Because the UN Convention started 50 years ago, and the aim of creating a drug-free world has egregiously failed. I mean, there are more drugs now than there ever were. They're stronger, they're cheaper. There are more users. I mean, it's just crazy. Yeah. So this goes to Einstein's definition of insanity. Something doesn't work. You try doing the same thing again and again, expecting a different outcome. You're not going to get it. And that's what we've seen with this. And it's reduced whole regions of the world to narco states, violence and things like Latin America.
Mexico.
Mexico's huge. Yeah.
It's just...
Yeah, so, they estimate that since they ramped the war on drugs up there 7 years ago, over 70,000 people have died in the crossfire, sometimes, incredibly brutally. Or you look at whole swathes of North Africa, which are the major transit zone of cocaine, and whole countries have descended into narco states. There's violence everywhere. Mali, Guinea-Bissau, even Libya, since Gaddafi was ousted, 90% increase in the heroin trade. Most of it is controlled by the local militias and insurgent groups and, the Al-Qaeda militants in Libya. Or Afghanistan, where since we've intervened, the acreage under the poppy growth has now doubled in most areas and trebled in some. So the trade there is worth $500 million per year, and all that goes into the hands of our terrorist enemies, the Taliban. And then we're supposed to be fighting them. $500 million can buy a lot of weapons and Kalashnikovs and things. So the sheer stupidity and madness of this, on a global scale, I find absolutely gobsmacking. And that is not before you even get down to the local harm, the local communities, the damage done to individual lives, the criminalisation of people who just want to take something, who might have a health problem, but then are thrown in prison. And the violence on our local streets and the fact that dealers can get out to our children much more easily because the whole thing is unregulated. Every which way you look at it, it's a mess. So I've got involved in this, and it might seem like an odd fit with some of the other stuff I work on, but I do see a link. The whole war on concepts, isn't it, really? Or war on nouns, where you've got the war on terror, the war on drugs, the war on the internet, and now the war on whistleblowers. And they all feed off each other, and they're all used, particularly the war on drugs, was like a prototype for the war on terror, where it was used to intervene across the world, it was used to destabilise countries, it was used to shred our civil liberties and invade our homes. Now we have the war on terror we can use for that, so we don't need the war on drugs so much. So
I didn't see that link as much before. 10 years from now, is it worse or better than it is today when it comes to prohibition of drugs and the war on drugs globally?
I think the prohibition will end. And I think, our grandchildren will look back on this period of madness, thinking, what the hell are our forebears playing at? Just as everyone looks back on alcohol prohibition as a period of madness too.
Right.
So it will end. It's a case of when, and also how we can manage that transition. Because at the moment what we have is a sort of global treaties, which is one size fits all. So all the countries are supposed to adhere to these UN conventions. And each situation, each country with different cultures and different roles in the trade will have to work out something individually for their nation state, what will work best for them. So, for example, if you're a consumer country in Latin America, how you deal with regulation, ending prohibition and regulating and taxing that trade will be very different from how a transit country, very vulnerable transit country, or Far Eastern country, or Middle Eastern country will deal with it, or how we in the West deal with it. But we're already seeing in the West, of course, many countries in Europe have decriminalised drugs.
Yeah. Portugal is very famous for it, right?
The Netherlands, of course.
Yeah.
And in America, going back to the turd analogy, the sheer hypocrisy of this blockage in the pipe, where you have two states that are fully legalised, even recreational cannabis use, and then trying to say to the rest of the world, don't do as we do as we say. It's crazy.
It is crazy to watch and then to see that it's still federally against the law and that law is being broken every day in Colorado hundreds of thousands of times. And so,
but even in the Netherlands, it's decriminalized, but you can't produce it.
Yes,
which is stupid too, right?
This is a huge problem because this means decriminalisation. You don't penalise the people who use it.
Right.
Which is harm reduction, which is fabulous. And we've seen this across many, many European countries. But it leaves the trade, as you say, in the hands of the gangsters and the terrorists. Yeah. So this is particularly where LEAP comes into it because, we're not interested in the low-hanging fruit and, grabbing someone who's smoking a joint. We're looking at the organised crime. And if you take away the profit motive from that trade, then that will that'll disappear. Governments can regulate, they can strongly regulate, they can do what they want individually as nation states. And if they so choose to, they can then reap the tax benefits of it as well. Yeah. There was a report came out from the Beckley Foundation, which does a lot of scientific research. It was announced a couple of weeks ago. And this Amanda Fielding. Have you had her on?
No, I had Professor David Nutt on, and I met her at one of his conferences. So.
No, she's fabulous. So I have to sort of do a bit of work with Beckley as well.
Okay.
But this recent report was very conservative, and it basically said if cannabis were legalised in the UK tomorrow, the increased revenue to the Treasury would be conservatively 1.25 billion per year from tax revenue and all the judicial process savings. So how can the Brits not afford to think about this? We're a broken country financially.
Yeah, how can anyone not afford to think about this? Sure. Current events. I want to get your thoughts on Syria. I find that a lot of times there is the story in the news, and then there's what's really happening, with all the bargaining and what's happening under the tables. And since you've been kind of in the intelligence service, you probably have some thoughts and insights about what the real bargaining is happening between the U.S., between Syria, France, UK. What are your thoughts, and where are we going with this?
Well, it's a mess, isn't it? It's the first step. Where do you even start with Syria? I suppose the thing that leaps out at me is this bogus chemical weapons use issue again.
So bogus, you think it's just...
Well, I mean, it looks from what the UN inspectors have said that there was some chemical weapons used, but nobody has a clue about who it was. And the fact they immediately said it's the Assad regime, and the fact that it would be so counterproductive for the Assad regime to have done it does smack of a sort of, should we say, false flag or dirty tricks type attack. Because, after Obama said it's the red line, and if he crosses this, we have to do something. So it's the same old tired excuse as they try to use in Iraq with the weapons of mass destruction. What's interesting on the internet is the views of everybody saying, what a load of crap. Of course not. We don't believe you this time.
Sure. When I'm believing Russia over the U.S., things have changed.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? For me, when I was watching that story, I was like, I don't know here. I kind of buying Russia. Like, let's figure out who actually did this.
Yeah, I mean, he came across as like
then.
a grand old statesman, didn't he, dealing with it? And Obama just looked like a brat.
I know. Russia wants to go to the table. It's like, hold on, what's going on here?
It's a strange situation because, like you said, Obama said this is the red flag. Then it happened, and then Obama says, "Oh, I guess we have to do something." But then, of course, he doesn't really want to do anything. So it's a very posturing, threatening, dangerous situation.
One explanation for that would be that if it were some dirty trick, then who would benefit most from forcing the Americans into the conflict? Israel?
Right.
One possibility. If we want to sort of peek behind the curtain and see where the vested interests are.
Yeah, that's interesting because that whole region, if any kind of shift in that region has unknown consequences to everyone. And even the Israelis, I know they've not traditionally gotten along with the Assad regime, but a lot of times people say Israeli would rather have them than someone else. I don't know if that's changed now.
Who knows? I mean, the opposition in Syria is just such a mess, and so many of the more organised and influential segments of it seem to be openly and avowedly Al-Qaeda links, like the Al-Nusra Front and things like that. So how, and we know this is happening already, the CIA and our special forces and the SIS can be on the ground giving help to these people and potentially funding and arming them, again, despite all the lessons of history, I just find flabbergasting.
I listened to the entire interview last night with Charlie Rose and the president of Syria. And if you listen to the whole thing, it's pretty interesting. I mean, I am not generally into conspiracy theories, et cetera, but when you listen to what he said, okay, you say terrorists, but if these people came to your country and did these things, if they did that to your country, you would do something about it. And he just goes through all of this reasoning, and
right.
He sounds much more reasonable than he's put out to be, when you actually sit down and talk to him.
Well, he was sort of thrust into this presidential role, wasn't he? I mean, he was happily living a quiet life in leafy North London, working as an ophthalmologist or whatever.
What is that?
Eye surgeon.
Oh, okay.
What's the word I'm groping towards?
Ophthalmologist.
Yes, thank you, ophthalmologist.
Yeah. Okay.
So there he was, he was the second son, happily married, leading this satisfying professional life. Suddenly his elder brother is killed, so he has to step up to the plate. I don't think he would ever envisaged that he would be this sort of international bogeyman dictator, wanted by the US and things.
Yeah, he kind of has that feel about him. What is the NSA doing right? And what is the US doing right when it comes to intelligence gathering? Is there anything where you're like, okay, this is good?
I think it's a rampaging beast that is out of control. It's like Godzilla.
Bull in a china shop.
Yeah.
Is there anything where you concede where you're like, okay, I can see that this is actually helping? Or is 100% of what they're doing just madness to you?
I think two answers to that. First of all, because of all this hysteria that's going on, it would be very useful for all our countries individually to take a deep breath and say, okay, what are we actually trying to protect here? Our national sovereignty, our national security. How can we best protect it and police it? And what are the threats coming in to try and attack us? How do we fight back against them? And then rejig their intelligence infrastructure to work within the law to effectively stop those threats and nothing else. They should not be seeing their peoples as threats, potentially, which is how they're treating us. So that is certainly one aspect. That's not to say good people don't work in the services. Trouble is, a lot of them tend to leave. But I'll give you one example. There's an organisation of former spies called the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity and Intelligence, which is a bit of a mouthful. And they give an award every year to someone coming out of the intelligence world who has demonstrated integrity. Normally it's whistleblowers. I mean, people like Colleen Rowley from the FBI and Tom Drake and WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden, of course, this year have received the award. But the one last year was to a guy called Dr. Tom Finger, who coordinated the National Intelligence Estimate of 2007, which in the US is, I think, 16 intelligence agencies. And he was asked to get the thinking of all 16 agencies on the Iranian nuclear capability. And unanimously, all these agencies said they stopped trying to get weaponized uranium and develop the bomb in 2003. No indication they've tried to restart this program. And Finger pulled all this together, wrote his report, and was subject to immense pressure by everyone in the American establishment who wanted that year to go into Iran in 2008. They wanted an excuse. And Finger just said no, and then eventually this thing appeared in public, and they had to admit that this was the thinking. So by his refusal not to cave into that pressure, he saved potentially millions of lives in Iran. So people like that with integrity, who can continue the fight on the inside and do it. I think it should be a lesson, a model to serving officers. And that's the difference that one man's bravery can make, and hats off to him.
Okay. Why do you live in Germany? Is it for security reasons, and do you miss the UK?
Well, I'm back in the UK quite regularly, so I can get all the bits I need. Well, partly it's a man, of course.
Okay.
But also, a few years ago, I was looking at some of the stuff that was going on with my electronic communications and things like that, and I was just getting sick of never feeling secure because, I'm a bit of a campaigner and I do public speaking and I write the odd article and that's it. I'm not breaking any laws. And yet my mobile phone started playing up and it acted as a recording device. So it'd be sitting on the desk and people could hear what was going on around it when they were trying to call in, but before the line opened. So I think some sort of software had been implanted and then it malfunctioned, and then I found out. 2008. So I thought, what the fuck? Why on earth are they doing this now? So that's when I thought, time for a rethink. Germany is great. Wow. Was great because they've had the police state thing, they had the Gestapo, they had the Stasi, they know how bad it can get, how quickly. So they do have a very strong constitution to protect the rights of their citizens, including not electronic snooping without due cause and all that sort of stuff. So they are pretty good, or so we thought. Of course, since the Snowden stuff's come out, it has emerged that the BND, which is like the CIA in Germany, has in fact been mainlining off some of this PRISM stuff and helping set up other very snooping devices like the X-Key score. So they are actually right at the heart of some of this illegal global snooping. And the question at the moment is, how much did the political classes know about this, or were they acting rogue? And we have yet to get a straight answer, should we say, from Angela Merkel. So Germany's not perfect, but at least it is much more conscious of how bad it can go and how quickly.
Right. Now, the new iPhone is out today, and the new operating system is out. Do we stay away from that device? Do we stay away from Apple? What is your advice to people?
Absolutely. Okay. They're dangerous, shiny, precious things. I'm not having a pop at one company or another. It's just the whole concept of proprietary software, closed software, which is what Microsoft works on, which is what Apple works on, which basically means that everything that goes on under the hood of your computer or your iPhone cannot be verified by you. You can't get into it. You can't see what's going on down there. If you use something which is open source, so it's sort of developed by hobbyists, by hackers, by geeks, it's all out there on the internet and you can download it for free, and it doesn't have backdoors because they check the code to make sure there's nothing nasty in there from the NSA, then that's much more stable and much more secure. And in fact, any flavour of Linux, which is the major open source way of using, I use Ubuntu, is actually much easier and much nicer to use than most of the proprietary systems, particularly as Microsoft spiraled into this strange parallel universe of Vista and Windows 8 and things like that. Yeah. It was all counterintuitive. So there's that aspect. It's the proprietary aspect, the closed aspect, which makes it dangerous. And it's also now, we have proof post-Edward Snowden, that yes, these companies have been cooperating very, very closely with the NSA. And also handing over the data and the records of their customers at the request of the NSA, if they needed it in the past. So that collaboration as well makes them dangerous in my view.
Are you labeled a conspiracy theorist? And if so, what does that make people think of you or people called that?
Oh, it's an interesting one. I mean, I have been called it in my time, but less and less more recently.
Okay.
Because so much of what I talk about is now coming to be proven true,
right. Okay.
like all this internet security stuff. So rather than me being seen as this mad paranoid person who probably sits hunched in a basement, sort of on their computer, suddenly actually, oh yes, what she said, she's been saying for years, oh, they are doing it. She might be right about that. She's right about that. What about the other stuff she talks about?
So the phone is ringing for speaking engagements.
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, when the Snowden story broke and things, it just went bonkers. I could barely get off my phone to go to the bathroom. It was interview after interview after interview. So that's fun, but I can't keep that up forever. So 1 or 2 days is fine. But yeah, the conspiracy theory name is an interesting one as well, culturally, the way it evolved, I think. Because in the 90s even, if that was in common usage, of course David Shayler would have been labelled a conspiracy theorist. When he exposed the Gaddafi plot. He was always dismissed as a fantasist back then, so it wasn't really in common usage even then.
Was the JFK the first modern version of that term?
I think so, yeah, but it didn't really cross the pond until after 9/11, I think, and then of course everyone who even questioned the official account, even whistleblowers from the intelligence agencies, could be dismissed that way. So it's a very sort of lazy label. And ad hominem attacks are the laziest ways of trying to undermine someone's arguments anyway. So.
Can you describe what that is to people that don't know? Because I was taught that when debating when I was a kid and like 15 years old, and they're like ad hominem attacks are not the way to debate. But for people that don't know, what is an ad hominem attack?
That's Latin for against the man.
Right.
So basically it's name calling, a bit like, you do when you're a 5-year-old in a playground.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Don't listen to him because he's a poo-poo pants.
Well, that's pretty much the level of a lot of debate you get on fora, isn't it?
Yeah,
So-
It's a lot of
especially
smart poo-poo pants, right? That's
Yeah.
the argument. Just because you poo in your pants doesn't mean you're dumb.
right. You might have a point. No, especially on BBC and a lot of cable television. I find it's just sometimes I can't believe I'm watching these things because these people are just discrediting each other and not actually talking about the argument.
Who's that guy? Was it Alex Rose from the U.S. who was talking to Piers Morgan and just was like making fun of his accent? Do you remember that?
Alex Jones.
Yeah, Alex Jones.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That
That was like, that's the epitome of.
I guess that is pretty ad hominem,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, he wasn't. Yeah, I guess that is. He wins that one.
Yeah.
I'm curious. When I graduated from university, there was a small desk of the recruitment fair that was the CIA recruiting. This was '93, and I was at MIT, and I guess they might have wanted some people, but they didn't talk about it much. And we always ask the advice question kind of at the end of the show, and I was wondering what advice you give to the people out there finishing university, where this used to potentially be this, exciting career. This you said James Bonds don't exist. They're usually hanging out in the embassy, bar. They're not really doing that. But what do you say to those people? Do they stay away from these agencies? Do you encourage them to go in and change these agencies? Is that a viable career for someone who's?
Theoretically, I think that's the great thing we need to encourage people to do, people with strong ethical frameworks, to go in there and try and change the systems from within and improve the systems from within, because that's the only way these secretive agencies will reform, realistically. So we need all the good people we can going in. The trouble is, I know from experience how difficult it is. Everyone is always told to keep their head down, don't rock the boat, just follow orders, that sort of thing. And then there's that sort of peer pressure to go along with whatever they suggest, which can get worse and worse and worse. So anyone thinking of doing it, please go in, please try and affect the change, but just be aware of the sheer pressure and the pushback that you might face. And then, of course, one day you have to think, well, might I see something so heinous, I'm going to have to take the next step and be a whistleblower. Would you be prepared to do that? Or would you, or could you be capable of living with yourself if you don't?
Right, could be time to go to Russia. I guess if you go on, it's interesting because we talk about this on Silicon Reel. It's the innovator's dilemma, and it seems to apply a little bit to intelligence services, except they're not corporations that can be broken by new change. But it seems like it's hard to get someone to look at new ideas, and they're doing things the wrong way when it's a government institution.
Yeah, it's a huge governmental monopoly, basically. The most secret and protected monopoly in the planet as well. Right. Where they're not accountable, they can get away with mistakes and lies. They're never held to account or put in prison.
It's almost technology's allowed them to be lazier than they once were. Because they can, like you said, they can just break into Facebook and it's all there for them, right? Or grab information, and it just makes their job easier that way, rather than actually have to, compile evidence and build a case and then go after them, right?
Well, the other thing to be aware of is it's not just all this electronic surveillance.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's a focus on it at the moment. There's also the infiltration aspect, where if you're an activist group or whatever, either you might get infiltrated by undercover cops posing as activists, or by people who are run as spies into the groups by MI5 or MI6, or increasingly these days by the corporate spies, the mercenary spies, as I always think of them, which are the sort of security organisations like Kroll or Aegis or Diligence. And these have exploded in size over the last decade.
There's a big corporate need for them in the U.S. I mean, everyone
Yeah.
gets background checks and credit checks and
Right.
drug tests for just normal jobs.
Yeah,
Right?
but it's not just the corporate staff. It's also, for example, if you're a defence contractor, a defence firm or something, and there's going to be a protest against your new weapon, outside your gates, then you can hire one of these companies to send infiltrators in to infiltrate these groups and subvert them from within. And, there was one jokey reference I read a while ago now. What was it? That any big environmental activist organisation you go to, any big demonstration or something, the chances are that up to 1 in 4 people there will be working for someone, which is horrifying.
1 in 4?
Yeah. It might be over-egging the pudding a bit, but...
Yeah.
And these people are often ex-official spooks, so they know all the sort of tradecraft and everything. There might be some amateurs there as well, who are usually the ones who are spotted. But, in terms of privacy and effective activism, it's very difficult when you're up against all this.
You gave advice to the people thinking about getting into the service. I was wondering what's the best advice you've ever received? And you've been in through some interesting places in your life.
Whoa. Best advice I've ever received. Probably get out before it's too late.
Yeah.
Catch that plane to Amsterdam.
Did people in MI5 know you guys were going to make this move, or did you have to keep it just between you and David?
Totally between just the two of us.
Okay.
We couldn't even let our family know. So the first they found out about it was reading the newspaper front pages.
I keep thinking of Jason Bourne, like, because Jason Bourne's doing all this stuff, but he knows how the system works. So he knows how, like, okay, if we do this, we know this is going to happen, and we know this is going to happen because you're versed in secrecy.
It was much more spy-like going on the run than it was actually working there, has to be said.
Were you wearing different disguises and things?
Sort of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. The last bit of advice we always ask is if you could make a phone call to the 20-year-old Annie and give her a bit of advice, what would you tell her?
Blow the whistle a year before, not just before Diana dies.
Okay. Well, for the media timing, or just it would have been smarter earlier?
It would have been smarter earlier, I think, as well. Because if we had gone public in 1996, it was the fag end of the Conservative government. They were deeply unpopular. And the Labour opposition would have jumped on the case as well and said civil liberties, whistleblowing, intelligence agencies running amok, and they would have fought to get an inquiry too. Of course, Tony Blair had just been elected. Summer of 97 was the honeymoon period. He just discovered probably all about his big fat MI5 file. So he did their bidding. As well as the timing with Diana. So, yes, I think that probably would be rather a key thing to have done differently. I wouldn't want to not have done it, though.
Okay. Every whistleblower needs a PR plan, it sounds like. Yeah. I mean, you really need to know how the media is going to receive you, how you're going to counter the different ways that the government's going to try to discredit you. Mm-hmm. Like you said, Ed Wood's done a pretty good playbook of how to do it. And like you said, if you get hit by a media event, like, I remember watching Mandela, and he was at the New York Times, he was right in the top. Mandela, Snowden, Mandela, Snowden. And you don't think about that being a factor. When we think about whistleblowers.
Well, I wish I hadn't actually, because it's such a grim thought. But
it's pretty grim. Just to wrap up, what are you going to be doing in 5 years or 10 years? I was thinking when she was talking, she'd be a great consultant for the NSA to reform the whole organization. But what will you be doing? I mean, is political office anything you're interested in, or what will you be doing?
God alone knows. I mean, I have difficulty enough planning 5 weeks ahead most of the time in my life.
Are you in demand to speak, or what's the biggest demand for you? I mean, which thing do people really like to hear your opinion on right now?
Mainly, I suppose the biggest demand is for me to give set public speeches to a variety of different organisations. I suppose some of the areas I cover are the influence of the media, the government and the spies over the media, and the whole whistleblowing thing, how to protect a source, that side of things, so the sort of media talk. And also the drugs issue is pretty big, and civil liberties and whistleblowing. So those are the three things I do. And then, of course, if some particular story breaks, then there will be TV interviews, there'll be writing articles, there'll be radio interviews, that sort of thing, and then it dies away again. What I need to do at the moment is a new book, which I'm gestating, shall we say, and I just need to have a bit of time just to sort of break the back of that and get it moving. So in terms of where I'll be in 5 years, no idea. Okay. Hopefully still doing the same sort of stuff, perhaps making a bit more of an impact, and hopefully working with a few more whistleblowers that have come out.
Okay. Do you get, I guess I can't ask if you get contacted by whistleblowers, but do you get advice from people that kind of want to know what to do?
Routinely, yes, I get asked a lot. Okay. There's a lot of people, though, you can't, you're not sure where they're coming from. I mean, it could be a sting operation, that sort of thing as well. But having contact with WikiLeaks and working with organisations like the Sam Adams Institute is stimulating, it's interesting. It feels like we're trying to make a difference.
Go ahead, sorry.
There was a big geek fest in the Netherlands every 4 years, and this was the year. And they had a big whistleblower track, so we got a lot of these American whistleblowers over, Colin Rowley, Tom Drake, Ray McGovern, Jessamine Raddock, all of them. So we did this big spook panel. And it was just fantastic, showing that you can survive the process, encouraging other whistleblowers to come forth, and also trying to get the geek community to really help and support the technological side for most whistleblowers. And they really got it. So I think there is hope, there is pushback from this endemic surveillance state. I think the geeks might be our best chance to save the world.
What, is Anonymous kind of like that geek whistleblower sort of oversighting, or maybe what's your take on Anonymous?
Well, they're anonymous.
Yeah.
Well, I've had contact from some. They're very supportive to the whole concept of whistleblowing.
Right.
So I feel like they have my back, shall we say, if anything happens to me.
Good.
I want to have someone from them on. Just to finish up, what's your take on Julian Assange?
WikiLeaks or Julian Assange?
Julian Assange.
Julian Assange is a man. I like him.
Okay.
I think he has consistently shown all the way through his adult life his attitudes to ethics and the capability of technology, a certain sort of protectiveness to people who might potentially try and do something like blow the whistle. I mean, he's been through the legal process in his late teens as well. And I think that the vision of WikiLeaks is world-changing. You know, what he was trying to do and why he was trying to do it. You give the information to the people. You impose transparency and accountability on evil big corporations, evil governments, evil intelligence agencies, and let the people make up their minds. And then only that way can you have true social justice. I mean, it's so blindingly obvious, but until he said it in that way, I think most people didn't think of it in that way. And the technology nowadays gives us the chance to do it. So WikiLeaks is a trailblazer. Julian Assange personally is a trailblazer. And I think the whole issues in Sweden have been blown out of all proportion. And if you know anything about the case, rather than just what's been represented in the mainstream media, but the timing of the way the women did it, the fact they were trying allegedly to sell the story, the fact that it was dropped and then it wasn't dropped and it was picked up by political opponents of his, the fact that Karl Rove has been in bed with the president of Sweden for years, the fact that Sweden is helping out with all this NSA surveillance stuff, they're in bed with the USA. So all of that stacks up as greater complicity than the Swedes would want to present and say, of course, we're independent. They're not. So I think that is a slight problem, and it's been overblown. But personally, as a man, he's bright, he's funny, a very dry sense of humour, and very committed to what he does. So, yeah, I like him.
Is he going to get out of that embassy in London, or do you think he'll be there for a while?
Who knows? I mean, it is a prison of sorts, but at least he's got the internet. And for a geek to have his computers taken away, that would be the worst form of torture possible. So I think he's happier there than he would be anywhere else at the moment.
Isn't there a movie coming out pretty soon?
They had one about him a few months ago, but I know he didn't. Was there another one?
I think so,
There's
yeah.
two, yeah, and
Okay.
both of them are hatchet jobs.
Yeah, are they?
So
Okay.
the first one was based on the WikiLeaks defector Daniel Domscheit-Berg, the German, who wrote a book on the back of this. He's the one who took all the really key data away from WikiLeaks, including lots of Bank of America information, which would have been crucial at this point.
Right.
So he wrote a book, and then David Lee and Luke Harding from The Guardian also wrote a hit piece book. And this is what formed the first film, which I think was We Steal Secrets or something. And there's some new one which has come out, which is
Sort of
apparently
Hollywood.
even worse. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got some...
He refused to be interviewed by both of them, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. It's I could listen to you for a long time, Annie. Thank you so much for being here. I know you did some filming for the Culture High yesterday. I can't wait to see you in that movie.
Yeah, it's gonna be
even
great.
though you've been here. How do people get a hold of you? Do you tweet, websites?
Yeah, sure. No, I do all that. Although I don't try not to use Facebook. I just have a presence on it, so I never respond to people there. My website's the best. It's anniemachon.ch.
CH.
So it's based in
Swiss.
Switzerland. Keep
Okay.
it safe.
Is that the safest place?
Yeah. And how do we know that? Well, because when WikiLeaks came under global assault,
Yeah.
it was the only country that did not take down the WikiLeaks website.
Right.
They said, no, freedom of expression. So a lot of people I know are now moving to Switzerland for that reason. So it's another handy hint. I'm on Twitter. It's just Annie Machon. All my social media sort of type crap is on an About Me page, so you can find me that way.
Excellent. Awesome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
I learned a ton. Is your brain hurting from all that
I
information?
should have taken notes. I'll have to rewatch this and get rid of my iPhone. And, yeah.
No, it's fantastic. Everyone's going to love watching this. There was a lot of information. Thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it. If you're listening to us on iTunes, you can see all of our faces on YouTube channel London Real, and we're on Twitter, Facebook, the whole thing. And until then, it's about the journey. Annie, I wish you all the best. Please come back sometime.
I will be very happy to. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Yeah, thank
All
you.
right. Take care, guys. This week on London Real, Bruce Perry of the BBC series Tribe.
I don't fancy my odds, really. I'm just going to visit these extraordinary people who really see the world in a different way and really trying to engage with them in a way that I've never done before. We see everything as disconnected, whereas a lot of the rest of the world sees us all as intrinsically connected, not only physically but also through our mental states. You know, I'm riddled with my own problems, my own insecurities, my own traumas, my own ego that's getting in the way, so I'm going through my own healing as I go.
On Sunday, London Real presents Bruce Perry, Quest.
when you try it, something really special happens and magic comes back.